This is the last clock that I made in 1994. It was an attempt to make something that was very different and based on clock photographs that I'd seen of a clock that had been made back in the 18th century, a long case clock. And the feature of this was the gear teeth were two staggered rows, and there's four rollers, so like four leaves on that this engages with, the same here and the same here, and I had extreme difficulty in getting that to work using the lignum vitae that I bought, which seemed to give off a sticky residue rather than providing me with lubrication. And I think what it is that the lignum vitae that was used in the old days is a different variety to the one that I bought when I made this back in the 80s. Sorry, beg your pardon, in the 90s. And now, because of CITES, it's not possible to get hold of the old type lignum vitae anyway. So I thought best thing to do was to replace all of the pivots on here, all of the rollers, with PTFE. So if you see white rollers anywhere on here or white pivots, that's what I've done, is I've used PTFE to reduce the friction, and that has made a big difference to the way the clock runs. It struggled to get it to run in the past, and I could tell that it was not lubricating properly, because when you ran the train with no escapement on and just moved the wheels by hand, you could hear it squeaking, which is not a good sign. So anyway, that now I've got to run, and you'll probably hear the odd clonk and see this wheel revolving. That's a remontoire, so that the clock itself is powered entirely by a very small weight, and that weight is wound up every 30 seconds when it's triggered by the train at the top, and it's wound. Obviously it uses a spring that's inside the barrel there to wind the weight back up again, and it's an endless loop chain with two small weights, one on this side and one on this side, and the differential between the weights, which is heavier on this side, gives me the power to run the clock. But it is quite a surprisingly small amount of weight that it needs to run, and when you hear it go with a satisfying clonk like that, you know that there's a sufficient reserve of power to get it to run. All of the wheels are made up from lots of different pieces of wood, and I bought maple, so each tooth is one wedge shape that goes down to the middle of this. So there's each of these teeth represents one wedge, each of those teeth is a wedge, and then there's a sandwich made up of, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces, 6 ply thick, and it's slightly thinner on the lighter gears. That was quite a bit of a problem to make, but very satisfying in the end. And the frame I made up by gluing maple together, and fairly straightforward woodworking kind of way. All the frame is pegged together with wedges, and that seems to work fine. The escapement is a grasshopper escapement, single pivot, as shown in the drawings of the Antiquarian Horological Society, which I found for the single pivot Harrison escapement. You can notice on the front that the seconds indicator is moving half second at a time with considerable recoil, but that's normal for this particular escapement, and it's a half second beat escapement, which is quite handy, because that then allows me to run the gear ratios to run seconds, and all of the train is run from this gear and its mating gear onto the escape shaft. So that's all the going part of it, and then all these gears to translate itself into minutes and hours. So I'm going to turn it round a bit more. stop it while I move it round like that. So I'll move this here. Here's a better look at the gear train. And you can see what I mean about the 4 little rollers on the gears. And the bottom weight here is the weight that runs the going side. The pillars are in boxwood. All of the shafts are steel, but they're covered in boxwood, and I drilled holes through the boxwood so it made it look as if it was made of wood. Most of these gears up here are boxwood. Fortunately that's still available in fairly decent quantities. So altogether quite a satisfying clock when it works, but it has been a bit of a nightmare to get it going properly, but now I'm hopeful I've solved all the problems I had with it. And I just couldn't face dealing with it for a number of years, but just recently I haven't had another go at it, and as I say, it seems much better now. This is the same escapement that I used in my earlier clock, which was based on Earl Smith's 2-arm grasshopper, but I replaced it with one of these drawn in the Antiquarian Horological Society book based on Harrison's drawings. This works very well. I didn't do anything to change the design at all, just made it as per the drawings. I've got the arbor at the top that this runs in on knife edges, running in V's in glass plates as the original was, so there's no friction in the escape arbor at all, and really on the going side there's not much friction, except probably from the gear going train, except for the hand gearing. But all told, it's turned out to be quite good as a clock, and certainly very different. Perhaps this will encourage 1 or 2 others to have a go at this particular form of gearing, which is certainly very different. Since filming the first part of this video, I've made some small changes. I found that the PTFE rollers were just a little bit too soft on the bottom 2 wheels, and were deforming slightly, making the engagement with the rollers not quite perfect. So my next idea was to change these so the PTFE is aligning inside a brass tube, and there's of course a pin that runs through, so they are true rollers. So the PTFE is a bearing surface for the brass tube, and that seems to work now really well. There's no sign of that distorting, and the clock now runs slightly more evenly and runs for longer. I'm just still calibrating how long I can get it to run for. So far the longest time is 2 days, but I'm sure I will get up to nearly a week when I've got it working properly. So I'm happy with that now. The other thing I have done is to locate a source of lignum vitae of the old type, so I could make new rollers out of lignum vitae and have that run without lubrication. The source for the lignum vitae is old bowling balls, but they're very difficult to hold when you cut them up. Once you've got them sawn in half, that's not too much of a problem. But anyway, I've now made a series of cylinder blanks for bearings and for rollers if I want to have a go at that later. But at the moment I think I'm inclined to leave it as it is, because that seems to be working well. Okay.